All right. So, Amy, thank you so much for coming. I want to get started with this wonderful interview. I wanted to tell you that I love this article that you wrote in last fall's Wise Traditions. And it was so interesting. I said, okay, I've got to write about this. But first, let's define hyperinsulinemia.
Sure. So the word hyperinsulinemia, I think, has the definition built right in. Hyper means high or elevated. Insulin is insulin, and the suffix emia means in the blood. So hyperinsulinemia means that your blood insulin level is too high. And when we talk about chronic hyperinsulinemia, that just means that your blood level of insulin is too high too often, too much of the time.
All right. Okay, early in your article, you mentioned that elevated blood sugar is a driving force behind chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes. Well, this is pretty much commonly known. However, you said something very interesting in the article, and this is what you wrote. Something that's far less appreciated is that it's possible to have perfectly normal blood sugar, yet can be at risk for severe health problems. Glucose alone doesn't tell the whole story, so please explain.
When doctors look for something like type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, they only ever look at your blood sugar. No one ever really measures insulin. And pardon me, in a lot of people, quite literally millions, that's not an exaggeration, quite literally millions of people, they have normal blood sugar, but the blood sugar is only normal because very, very high insulin is keeping that blood sugar in check. And that process can go on for years, and in some people, decades. And it's only when that's gone on for so long that the insulin is no longer able to keep up. That's when the blood sugar actually starts to rise. But by the time that happens, even the high insulin itself, even when the blood sugar was normal, the high insulin is a driver of a lot of different chronic health issues that a lot of people have now. And they have no idea it's coming from chronically high insulin because nobody ever measures insulin.
Mm-hmm. So do doctors now measure insulin, or do you have to request it, or what?
The ones who know about all this will measure a fasting insulin. So a lot of the sort of low carb and ketogenic savvy doctors will order the fasting insulin. Most regular mainstream doctors that are not aware of this don't order it ever. They don't even really think it's an issue. And sometimes if you want it, you have to specifically request it, and you have to specify, I want fasting insulin, because your doctor will be like, well, you mean glucose, right? And you're like, well, I want the glucose, but I also want the insulin. You have to specify because it's not a common routine test. You have to insist that is what you want.
Okay, so in your article, you list several conditions that are associated with elevated insulin levels, even when glucose is normal. So here are some that you've listed, just 5 of them: hypertension, obesity, heart disease, migraine headaches, and Alzheimer's. So are you saying that constant elevated insulin is linked to other serious diseases other than type 2 diabetes?
Yes, absolutely. And just to clarify, in migraine, not everybody with migraine has the chronically elevated insulin, but the wide fluctuations, the ups and downs in blood sugar and insulin do seem to be an issue for at least some portion of the migraineur population. And I want to clarify something real quick too, just so people sort of understand the situation here. When we were talking about the fasting insulin test before, that the keto and low carb savvy doctors order it, most other doctors don't. The fasting insulin test is useful, but it's not a slam dunk, because just like with blood sugar, blood glucose, there's a lot of people whose fasting level of insulin will be normal, meaning after overnight, it's been 8 or 10 or 12 hours since you ate, you go to the lab to get the blood drawn. By that time, your insulin has come back down to normal and it's nice and low. But there's a lot of people that after a meal, particularly after a meal that's high in carbohydrate, the insulin skyrockets and it stays elevated for a longer period of time than in a sort of metabolically healthy person. So that's the chronic hyperinsulinemia we're talking about, because some people will be missed just by looking at the fasting level, because there's some people, like I said, the fasting is normal, but it could be elevated through most of the rest of the day, depending on what somebody's eating.
Got it.
But yes, this chronically elevated insulin pattern is either the main cause of or an exacerbating factor, a factor that makes worse many, many health conditions, even beyond just the 5 you mentioned.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Verta Health and Dr. Sarah Hallberg's research team. And they recently did a published a paper that showed that type 2 diabetes is reversible, which is a very inspiring statement, and it's a landmark publication, and I'm so excited about it. So what are your thoughts on this study?
Well, so Verta Health has published a couple of studies now. There's more than one, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but in general, yeah, their work shows that type 2 diabetes can be put into what we call remission, and depending on your definition of the term, some people would say reversal. So some people will say that remission is, or cure, like reversal or cure versus remission. Some people would say remission is a normal blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C level for a certain number of months or years, and then reversal or cure is a normal blood sugar for a much longer period of time. It's something like 5 years. I don't know if there is an official, officially defined or accepted time frame for that. Like, okay, we can put on your chart that your diabetes is reversed or in remission in this period of time, or we can expunge it from your record completely if it's been this amount of time. I don't know, but I think there is consensus, at least among the low carb research community, that this is possible, that somebody can, through diet and lifestyle alone, totally be free of any diagnostic criteria that they would use to tell you that you have type 2 diabetes.
It's amazing, isn't it? Okay, so I watched your interview with Dr. Perlmutter about your new book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having it.
And as you can see, the books that I read look like this. The books that I have read. Let me show you how I
love it. I love it. Yeah.
Well, that's how I learn, and they end up looking like coloring books.
That's why I cannot do electronic books. I'm old-fashioned. I like to flip through them. I like to dog ear. I like to make notes. I can't do electronic books.
I know. I don't know what it is. Just old school. But so as you can see, there are no tabs, which just means I'm just now starting your book, and so I would like at some point when I finish, I'd like to interview you about this.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Perlmutter actually wrote this in the foreword. Okay, it says, the dietary recommendations in this book become most valuable, and he compliments you on bringing healthy fats back to the table, advising us to avoid sugar and refined carbohydrates. So that, to get that sort of comment from him is pretty amazing. So tell us a little bit about that.
I met Dr. Perlmutter recently, but my publisher put that together. I had not actually met him in person when he did the foreword to my book, but my book about Alzheimer's disease and dietary and lifestyle factors that contribute to it is like right up his alley. He does a ton of research in that area. He wrote his own book, Brain, and I think Brain Makers is the other one that he wrote. They just, in a nutshell, they now regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. And it's basically neurons in affected areas lose the ability to properly metabolize glucose. So you can kind of call it an energy crisis or an energy shortage in the brain. But ultimately, this is a metabolic problem. And when I say metabolic, I mean it has to do with the way the brain gets energy, right? Metabolic is all about energy. And I don't know how deep in the weeds you want me to get specifically with the Alzheimer's, but going off of that interpretation of the data and of the body of research over the last century on this illness, that it's a metabolic disease, then there's a metabolic, like if it's a diet and lifestyle metabolic disease, then there's a diet and lifestyle metabolic solution to it, just like there is for type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And chronically high insulin is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's. There are certainly genetic risk factors. Everyone just thinks it runs in families, or if your parents get it, you're going to get it. Actually, regardless of your family history and regardless of your genes, chronically high insulin is a major, major risk factor for this condition.
Okay, but generally speaking, most of these chronic diseases, they're rooted in inflammation. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no, because I like to say, are you sick because you're inflamed, or are you inflamed because you're sick? So inflammation is not a cause of anything, in my opinion. Inflammation is the response, right? Inflammation is your body's way of healing from injury, whether it's a physical trauma, like if you get a really bad cut, what happens? The area swells, it turns red, it turns painful. That's the immune system like marshaling resources to that area. But the thing is, it's inflammation is not always a response to a physical trauma like that. It could be what I would call a biochemical insult, a biochemical harm or danger or damage. And that can come from eating foods that the human body is just not really designed to eat, or consuming foods that you in particular are sensitive to or intolerant to, whether or not you know it, right? There's a lot of low grade sort of chronic inflammation induced by dietary factors where it's not like you're allergic in the sense that you pass out or you break out in hives or something almost like life threatening could happen. It's these sort of low level, it could manifest in acne, in rosacea, in joint pain, in muscle stiffness, in all kinds of ways that we don't recognize as the body trying to like fight something off that it doesn't want to have inside it.
Mm.
So does inflammation cause the illness? No, in my opinion, inflammation is the response to the damaging processes that are driving the illnesses.
Mm. Going back to Dr. Perlmutter's book, his phrase, what is actionable is something that he asked his guests. So what's the very next step who is concerned about type 2 diabetes? What's the next step toward, improving their health?
Well, so it depends on where they're starting from. The next step depends on their baseline. So I would recommend that everybody just gets like a routine blood work done, but get the fasting insulin, get your C-reactive protein, get your vitamin B12 level checked, because a B12 deficiency alone can cause cognitive impairment if we're talking about Alzheimer's. But with regard to type 2 diabetes, get a baseline, because see where you are. Maybe you're perfectly healthy, and so what you're doing already is working really well and you don't need to change anything. Maybe it's not working so well, and maybe it's a lot worse than you're aware of, and it's really scary. Like, even personally, it can be really scary sometimes to get that blood work done, but it's important because it tells you, okay, where am I? Because then if you do institute a change, whatever change it happens to be, you have something to compare to 3 or 6 or 12 months later. Like, is this actually helping? Are my numbers getting any better? So I do think for most people that are already on the path toward type 2 diabetes, the number one most effective, easy action, we're talking about actionable information, the easiest action to take is to eliminate foods from your diet that raise blood sugar. And they will also raise insulin. So that's going to be all the simple sugars, all the refined carbs. In some people, depending on how sensitive they are to carbohydrate, in some people, that's also going to mean either reducing or totally eliminating foods that we might otherwise consider wholesome or nutritious, things like potatoes and brown rice and beets and certain fruits. So it's not that those foods are inherently bad, or like damaging. It just, depending on your state of health or your individual response to carbohydrates, some people have to be really, really low in total carbs. Some people can be a little more generous.
I remember one of the things that I noticed immediately when I started really reducing my carbs and sugars, my energy in the afternoon is so much better. I used to be so tired, and I don't have that anymore. It was like instant. It was great.